This is Suchitra Vijayan, and you're joining us for the Polis Project's weekly podcast. Every Wednesday leading up to the American presidential elections, the Polis Project will host activists, organizers, writers, reporters, and progressive voices as a part of our politics podcast. They don't just tell you what happened, they inform you of the issues, policies, legislations that matter to their communities beyond the headlines. Earlier this month, Middle East Eye's reporter Azad Essa published a long scathing piece on Emgage, a prominent 501c3 that claims to advocate for American Muslims, but on the contrary, serves to mute their voices. The piece raises some very important questions. Who gets to speak and advocate for American Muslims? How, in the name of diversity and having a seat in the table, often issues that matter to Muslim Americans are delegitimized? And more importantly, how these actions affect the fight against zionist ideologies and fail to address the rise of right wing Hindutva forces and the role they play in American elections. Joining us today to discuss the piece and continue this conversation is Azad Essa, a senior reporter with Middle East Eye based in New York. He's the author of Muslims Are Coming and Zuma's Bastard. We have Samia Assed, a very respected Palestinian American activist from New Mexico and the Democratic Party delegate. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Azad, I'm going to start with you. Your recent report is a scathing indictment of how Emgage, an organization meant to advocate for Muslim voters, actually muscled their voices. Can you lay out briefly why you decided to cover the story and what was it like to write about it?
Thank you, Suchitra, for having me on this podcast and for having this discussion. By all measures, this was going to be touted as the most important election in American history from the start. Given that everything that has happened, given everything that has happened under Trump and how embarrassed the liberal establishment has been to have Trump as America's citizen number one. And so we felt at Middle East Eye that it was really important to try and understand how Muslims would be engaged with, this election season, given the abuse that they faced in Trump's, initial election campaign in 2016, and of course during his presidency itself. And early on, the talk was that Muslim and Black people and other minorities need to get out to vote to dislodge Trump. So in order to understand, or measure the Democratic establishment's ability or interest in moving beyond their own biases about Muslims, this meant that we would have to carefully follow how the Democratic establishment talks to Muslims and which Muslims get visibility and, which Muslims get to speak. And now this brings us to Emgage. So we were first introduced to Emgage early in the year. It was around February 2020. I was particularly curious about the organization when Senator Bernie Sanders said he was honored to have been endorsed by Emgage. I found it surprising because I hadn't heard of the organization before. And I did some basic research on some of the leadership, and then I found that the co-founder, Farooq Mehta, had been Hillary Clinton's Muslim outreach person. And just prior to the Bernie endorsement, the same Farooq Mehta had held a fundraiser for Joe Biden. So I found it odd because this seemed like a run-of-the-mill kind of establishment type organization, and I found it strange that Senator Sanders would be so, excited by the endorsement. Now, I also found that they had odd links with the Anti-Defamation League, a civil rights organization that actually weaponizes, anti-Semitism. And some of the board members from Emgage had gone to Israel on this trip called the Muslim Leadership Initiative, which is kind of like a trip that tries, or a project that tries to reframe the Israeli occupation as a kind of dispute between Jews and Muslims. And I thought, hold on, is this the group that is really positioning itself as the all-important go-to Muslim organization ahead of this year's election? Something seems off. So, not to go on a long story here, but so we started looking for people who knew the group, and they tried to put me in touch with others who had things to say. And they had a lot to say, but they expressed some trepidation in doing so. They mostly didn't want to go on the record. They said that they were afraid, or that they didn't want to ruffle feathers. And they also said that they thought Emgage was possibly trying to change. So through the advice of my editor, I decided I'd take some of this information and I would head to DC and interview the co-founder, Khurram Wahid, and ask him some of these questions straight up. So this was back in March, just as COVID-19 was starting to take hold of the US, so to speak. And I actually remember, rushing back to the train, to get my transport back to New York. And I was rushing, and I started coughing as I entered the train. And I thought people would wonder if I was, sick. I mean, we had no idea that COVID would become the pandemic that it did become. But in saying that, once I returned, I had to bury the story because we had to prioritize COVID-19, and then Black Lives Matter protests, and then Israel's planned annexation, and so on and so on. Still, as the months went on, I continued to follow Emgage's work, and I watched as Palestinians and Indian Americans grew more and more frustrated with Biden's campaign, and with Emgage. And so then it became increasingly clear to me, at least, that this organization and its leaders were using the fear of Trump to elevate their importance. And they were using the fear of Trump to control what Muslims were asking for from the Biden campaign. So I slowly continued working on these sources, knocking on the door. And then September came, and then Electronic Intifada published its piece on Emgage. And then the floodgates, opened.
And I kind of want to, one of the themes that runs through the story is, of course, about who gets to speak for and decide on and represent the Muslim community's issues in the corridors of power. And I'm quoting this directly from the piece that you reported. I want to go to Samia and return to this question of muscling and moderating the critique of power. I want to come to Samia and ask you, are those who speak now as pundits and representatives of the large, diverse Muslim communities in America actually representative of those voices and concerns? And the second question is, can you walk us through how this affects the framing of issues that really matter to Muslim communities?
If you're asking me about candidates like Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib and elected officials, I think there's a sense of accountability, especially with Rashida and Ilhan, who ran their campaigns as grassroots campaigns. If you're asking for organizations and leaders of organizations, I think there's a need for our communities to really address the pipeline to leadership. And how do we instill it in these organizations that leaders have held on to positions for decades, and there's no real opportunity to engage the real dire needs of the communities. So if you're asking me about the pundits of who represents the Muslim community at large, there needs to be more of a leadership that really is engaged with the grassroots. If you want to ask me about Emgage has no touch with the grassroots. It was never birthed out of a movement or a need to address the real dire issues of the community. I'm a grassroots organizer, and I work day in, day out with the Muslim community, with the Chicana community, the indigenous community, connecting the dots with movements that are building the movements across the U.S. for years now. I feel like Emgage has no authenticity, no really have not been transparent, have not been truth-telling, and really have not had any accountability to the community. They've risen to power on the backs of the issues that, let's say, Palestine or Muslims in India or Kashmir, these causes that have been pushed aside, and people have risen to power on their backs, really. So there is no, as it regards to Emgage, I don't think they're representatives of the Muslim community at all.
So in the piece, Sarbat Hussain, the co-chair of the American Muslim Democratic Caucus, says she has been familiar with Emgage since 2012. And then her first interaction with the group's leadership involved her being told by Emgage both to downplay her Muslimness. This was, I mean, of course, not shocking, but again, one of those moments in the piece that is really, quite something. Again, you see, I kind of want to go back to Samia again, and you also speak about this element of tokenized engagement, such as MLI and MJAC had paved way for this idea of good Muslims with whom Israel and the US power base can negotiate. Can you tell us how this plays out? And also, when we were earlier talking today, you talked about this Islamophobia, about how there's a certain way in which women who wear hijab, who are part of this movement, who organize, are also treated within these organizations.
Well, that's a reflection of these spaces that don't do the work to address internalized Islamophobia, the hijab, the representation, the true understanding of Islam, and that's a deep issue within the community that we have to address with secular Muslims who claim Islam and with real Muslims who want to be true to their best self in spaces of power, and in a form are denied on these platforms. I'm sorry, what was the first question you asked me about? The tokenization. When you go into different communities, and this is something I was telling you about earlier, of how I noticed, even within my own community as an organizer, all of a sudden I see spaces that are, they'll come in, Muslim Jewish Alliance, or let's just take that on because it's domestic. And we see how, they come into spaces, into our mosques, into our student-led organizations, and they look, they don't look harmful. They come in good intentions under the banner of interfaith. So, of course, we as Muslims want to be part of a good network that really wants to build on relationships. What happens is that this undermines the ability of community and leadership to really hold accountable any real threat overseas or action that's been done by Israel. So a lot of times they will say, let's talk about Muslims and Jews. We love each other, but let's not talk about Palestine. Let's not talk about that. Oh, that's too radical. Let's not do that. That's too much troublesome. We really don't feel comfortable with doing that. And that's happened over and over and over, in a sense, almost emotionally blackmailing Muslims to not speak, or else they'll be considered, too radical or too dangerous, or that's territory that you shouldn't go into. And that, in the sense, that's forming the good Muslim. Also, as well as the Muslim Leadership Institute, what the danger is that they go in, they train them, they groom them to understand and build the same kind of relationship as it starts in the little mosque, but on a much higher level. And they give space and power and platforms and positions, and the real muzzling happens on leadership positions. Like when you go into Biden's campaign and you want to be a representative of the Muslim community, you as Emgage have already made those concessions before you go into the door, before you sit on the table, because you've been groomed to not shake up for the sake of unity. Let's not mess up. Don't even bring it up, and you'll get what you wanted. Of course, the establishment wants a good Muslim, wants a representative. They want us tokenized. They want our money, and they want our vote. There's a good Muslim concentration in swing states where they have an impact. But the reality is they are selling out the basic needs and the basic needs to address human rights violations for the Muslim community. And that's the danger.
And Azad, I want to come back to you. What were the difficult aspects of covering the story? And what were the most extraordinary findings that you did find as in the process of doing and reporting the story?
Yeah, there were many difficulties, as you can imagine. Firstly, the Muslim American activist scene is relatively small. Everyone sort of knows each other. And so getting people to speak out on these irregularities was always going to be a challenge. Secondly, Emgage says that they're merely engaging with other organizations. And this goes back to what Samia said in her last point. And so what they're saying is that talking to these organizations shouldn't imply that they are cooperating. And I can appreciate that. I mean, I'm a journalist. My job involves talking to different people. So I had to pay special attention to Emgage's claims and try to discern between their claim of engagement versus their critics' claim of complying and ceding ground to these groups like the ADL. So Emgage also says that they don't have any formal relationships with any of these groups, and that their personnel, the people in Emgage who might have engaged in these programs, had done so, in their personal capacity. But these are also sort of like straw man arguments. So my job was to investigate what they are what they're about as an organization, and if these informal relationships actually impede or influence the types of work that they do, the issues that they advocate on, and the kinds of candidates they endorse. And this is what we precisely found, ultimately. And in a nutshell, they have endorsed like pro-Israel candidates, including congressmen and congresswomen, state legislators that have either supported Trump's embassy move to Jerusalem or co-sponsored anti-BDS legislation in the state legislature. They've endorsed candidates who have taken more than, collectively $600,000 worth of cash from pro-Israel groups since 2017 alone. They have also endorsed a congressional candidate like Shri Kulkarni from Texas, who has taken tens of thousands from Hindu nationalists. So if you ask me what is extraordinary, is that it's not particularly hard to find any of this information or particularly hard to find these connections. It's almost as if like it's a callous approach to the community.
So I actually want to kind of also look into the other issue, where you also talk about Shri Kulkarni and Hindutva, and how Emgage also refused to actually, in real terms, engage with that. There's one piece in the essay where it very specifically says that they refused to address issues of Hindu nationalism because they realized that it wasn't going to bring them a bit of revenue. Can you kind of walk us through that as well?
That me?
Yeah.
Sure. You want to know how they didn't want to engage with the Kulkarni issue before? Mm-hmm. Okay. So what we found was that the candidate, the one particular staff member from Emgage told me that, Emgage engages in issues that often just mirror US State Department sort of like rhetoric or the US government's approach to issues. Now, when it comes to the Uyghur issue, when it comes to Rohingya in Myanmar, it's very, very close to how the US government approaches these issues. When it comes to Modi, they're a little bit more careful. Now, when it comes to issues that concerning the Indian Muslim American community, what we were told was that Emgage, from Emgage's side, they said that they were not told that Shri Kulkarni had been taking money from Hindu nationalists in 2018. But sources that I spoke to, including former staff members, said that they were told repeatedly by the community. And so this goes back to the point where they firstly endorse candidates that think that they're going to win. So they can say we endorsed 100 candidates that actually won. So they feel that Kulkarni is the candidate that can win. Also, Kulkarni is the candidate that's standing against a sort of like a almost Trump-endorsed candidate. So it kind of like fits into the Democratic Party's agenda. And secondly, that they don't listen to the community at all. And so there are other stories with regards to Kulkarni in that even though even if we agree that, or we can, let me start again. Even if we accept that they didn't know in 2018 that they didn't know about the money coming into Kulkarni, Kulkarni went to Howdy Modi in 2019, and they knew about it as well. And they still did nothing about it as well. So there is a disconnect between what the community asks for and what they're willing to concede. And they continuously hide it behind this rhetoric that, this is about the right wing. We need to get rid of the right wing. So no matter what Kulkarni has done, we're going to neglect that and forget about that because the right wing is the only issue at hand.
Samia, I kind of want to go back to the Palestinian issue and how that was addressed. Can you walk us through how Emgage misrepresented the Israeli occupation, or how the demands for Palestinian human rights and dignity and self-determination is often framed as unreasonable or radical positions. And often they're framed as interfaith dialogue, Muslim visibility. But in reality, what you're really seeing is these so-called leaders collaborating with the state against the interests of the Muslim communities. Can you walk us through that, please?
What's at heart with what's happening with Emgage and the normalization, the relationship that normalizes these Zionist organizations is really the narrative. Zionist organizations want to control the Palestine narrative, and in essence, controlling what gets to the White House, what gets to the American public, what gets to the American legislative branch and the judicial branches. This is where the harm comes into. If you have players that have normalized this, they are in fact doing the work and bidding the work of the Zionist organizations to numb down the real legitimate anger and concerns of Palestinians and Muslim communities around the world. So Palestine, for one, BDS, Emgage's policy on BDS is the same as Biden's. It's like every American has a right to boycott, divest, and sanction. But instead of saying, look, we want to boycott those human rights violations, don't give money to the Palestinians. There's no agenda for Emgage that actually is condoned by the Palestinian community. It's not informed by the Palestinian community. How can they represent our concerns? That is the big problem. I don't want somebody from Emgage speaking for a Palestinian community without the Palestinians being in the room. In the meeting with the Biden campaign after the Biden attack on Linda Sarsour, I was in that chat. And I had expected to speak. I am a Women's March board member. I'm a hijabi woman. I'm an aggressors activist. You think I would have been the first one to actually explain how harmful and dangerous those comments were to a hijabi woman. And we were denied that. We were denied, and it wasn't, and they'll tell you, oh, we opened it up. We gave the platform. But in fact, what happened it was a display to appease the Muslim community, but at the same time, build power with the Biden campaign to say, look what we're doing. We can gather up the Muslim community, and we're the spokespeople for this community. And they're not. What they did was anger us tremendously. So Palestine has to be represented by people who will be unwavering in their commitment with the truth and accountability and the facts on the ground, because I want somebody to go in to negotiate. You better go in strong. If you're gonna digress and water down our demands, step aside. You're not gonna be able to represent us. That's my concern with Emgage.
Would you say then would you articulate this as saying that this is building power at the cost of the Palestinian people?
100%. 100%.
Azad, the piece has been out, it came out in early October. Since then, there have been other conversations, there's been more information that's come out. What has been the response to the piece?
So the piece, according to our stats on the site, has been read quite widely and engaged with in ways that we possibly didn't expect, because it's such a ridiculously long piece. But I think for those who care about the issue and want to know precisely and exactly what's going on with regards to this organization, with regards to the Muslim community, I think they are reading it. And I know for a fact that at least two donors, Emgage donors, are also engaging with the piece and looking into Emgage, as a result of the piece, as well as all the other stuff that has come out related to the issue. I know that other organizations, Muslim organizations, are feeling the heat as well, and that Muslim representatives in state and Congress are also paying attention to this. From Emgage's side, there hasn't been any response. But I would just like to say one other thing with regards to what Samia said in her last point, and that is that there's still no indication when Emgage makes these decisions or makes these statements how they reached consensus on anything.
How do you see Muslim communities today and their place in America, given that Trump is still a president and there are conversations about there not being a peaceful transition of power? How do you see this moment for Muslim communities?
We're at a very critical juncture, to say the least. I want to go back just for a second for what Azad said about Emgage and some of the comebacks to the story, which I thought was a brilliant piece and good analysis. I felt like they couldn't even answer some of the claims with the article in the piece. So some of the cheapest shots that I've heard is that we want to talk about domestic and not foreign. This is a Muslim organization claiming to represent Muslims who said this. It's ridiculous. The one thing that is domesticated is the Israel issue, but we're not allowed to talk about Israel because we want to talk about domestic, right? And the notion of this suppressing voting, and I think I addressed that in the article. It's like, no, our voices are suppressed from saying the true needs of the Muslim community. They don't have the bandwidth or the experience or the grassroots to give you the 1 million Muslim votes. They don't have capacity. They promised a lot in the name of Muslim community and robbing us of the structures and the Lionheart share of funding that should be going for the organization that do the work on the ground. That's one thing. Going back to the status of Muslim community within, how do I view the Muslim community? Like I said, we're at a critical juncture. On one hand, we understand the political moment of where we really have to mature, and the Muslim community has matured to understand that we have a civic responsibility on our shoulders to engage, to vote, to get involved in the system. But at the same time, I would say that we have to always, as a community, get out of our silos, understand that we have to be informed by grassroots, understand when we give there's candidates to run or organizations that claim to represent us, do the vetting on them. We owe it. We can't just take things at face value. Our lives and our kids' lives and our families' lives overseas are at risk for real. And like I said earlier, we really need to create the pipeline to leadership. So the Muslim community has a lot at stake and must rise, because the 4 years ahead of us are extremely even more. This is where we build on for the next 4 years. And this political moment to get out, we're going to have to vote. But don't give your voice and your narrative to anybody else that doesn't really address your needs.
As soon as the piece came out, Mehdi Hasan recently tweeted that it's sad to see Muslim American community organizations eating each other just weeks out from a crucial presidential election in which a proud purveyor of Islamophobia is on the ballot. I know, Azad, that you've actually pushed back against that tweet. But of course, this tweet is also a reminder of the strategies used by the Democratic Party for decades. And there's also something in the piece that you flag through Professor Kazi flags in the piece, in which she says, we weren't met with the desperate pleas that this is the time, it is the most important election. So please set aside your agitations or your aspirations now. What do these strategies signal to you? Because Mehdi Hasan is seen as one of the most prominent, visible voices, right? I was wondering if Azad, you could respond, and perhaps then Samia can then respond in terms of what do these public takes do in terms of strategies and also crafting the narratives.
So I think it's summed up in Professor Kazi's quote, it's what they do every election. It kind of signals that there isn't any better argument than that, or they don't have a better argument than that. In the piece, I explained that none of the activists who spoke to Middle East Eye with regards to critiquing Emgage said that they would vote for or encourage, others to vote for Trump because of Emgage. There's no evidence to suggest that critiquing Emgage would result in a lower Muslim turnout. So I don't understand these arguments at all. Mehdi, incidentally should know better, because there are similar dynamics in the UK where Muslim organizations are literally set up to police the community. And Mehdi Hasan, he's not alone in this, but his comments actually goes to the heart of the issue. The purveyor of Islamophobia is not just Trump, and the ballot is Islamophobic either way. And so to ask Muslims to keep quiet is disturbing. What do they signal? I don't know. I disconnect with the community. I don't know. I just don't think someone like Mehdi Hasan needs to be taken seriously, on this issue.
Yeah, I have to agree with you if I can. That's okay. So I respect Mehdi Hasan, but I think he was out of line without doing his homework. And in this sense, unless he was doing the bidding for the Democrats, he had no right to, summarize our critique of Emgage as Muslim organizations eating at each other. If anything, this is an educational campaign, And at the heart of it is really wanting the Muslim community to wake up from this deep sleep to understand where to put their money, where to put their trust, how to hold their leaders accountable, and also let politicians, whether they be the Democrats or Republicans, they have to know that Muslims are not going to deviate from their messaging or their narrative. Nobody's going to buy our voices. Regardless of who you vote for, nobody has to buy our vote, our vote and our say. I was just amazed at how I think he didn't do his homework, to be honest with you. And then, to see Americans, there's Democrats, whether the Black community, you name it, all impacted communities are saying, you know what? Why do I have to settle for the argument that I have to vote for Biden? It doesn't work. It's just an empty thing. And if the Democrats, the centrist Democrat and the Democratic establishment got away with it and had Biden as a candidate, the next 4 years are not. It's a different campaign. And that's why it's critical for us to establish organizations that truly represent us and don't just want to capitalize and profit off of our community, and actually do the work that needs to be done to organize for the next 4 years.
We are towards the end of the podcast segment, and this question goes to both Azad and Samia. We're 3 weeks away from the elections. What are the key takes that you want our audience to take away, and what is your message to a larger audience?
Samia, you can go.
Key. I'm sorry, what you just said. Key what?
The key message that you want.
Yeah, so sorry, I got cut off. Key message. Oh my gosh, what have we been saying? The key message is like, get educated, understand who you're voting for. It's okay to be critical, because you know what? We're worth it. Our kids are worth it. Our communities are worth it. So the message to the Muslim community is, yes, practice your right, your sacred right, in a sense, because it is a democratic state and we have the right to vote, and we should utilize it for the sake of everybody being bombed and killed and murdered and slaughtered overseas. We need to vote, and we need to vote for our kids here, for their education, for their healthcare, for every issue that faces us as a community. We're no different than average Americans. The takeaway for us, where you give blind faith to organizations like Emgage, no more. It cannot. We will have to create institutions that vet leadership, that vet organizations. I will say, I didn't have an opportunity to say that organizations like American Muslims for Palestine eventually did take a stand, and they did take leadership, and they understood. And USCMO, all of the organizations, the 13 umbrella organizations that actually brought in Emgage, they have to do the vetting themselves too. It just can't be the people. The people look for the leadership. So leadership has to be really responsible and has to buckle down and understand the responsibility that lays on their shoulders. It's tremendous. If you're not up to it, you have to step aside and let new leadership come in that is willing to engage, willing to hold people accountable, willing to do the work that needs to be done for our community.
Azad, do you want to?
I think Samia has a lot more experience in this thing, but I guess I would say that with 3 weeks to go, I think it's really important that people also understand that it's not just about a presidential election. It's not just about the national vote. It's also about these local, races that are taking place. And I think, this emphasis, this incredible, almost hyperbolic, emphasis on national elections takes away from a lot of real fights that are taking place on the ground, and real work that is taking place on the ground. And I think that people need to remember that. So yes, they should be voting, and I think it's pretty clear who they should be voting for. But at the same time, they need to know that that's just one thing as part of a larger story.
And I will add to that, is that you're right. All power is local. And our Muslim communities have to get out of their silos. They have to engage other communities in their struggles to understand how they defend theirs. All too often, we think we stay in our own and we just defend, and we listen to the uncles and the people. And yes, they have their respect. But understanding how American politics plays out in the community to Americans, and in a foreign policy that's, it's the imperialist agenda is it plays out into domestic, and we have to understand look locally how that plays out. Get engaged, start out small, participate, support, and don't be the naysayers. Move forward, because you know what? Our religion mandates it, our community mandates it, and you live in somewhat of a structure of a democracy to do so. Do it.
So the message goes out saying educate, agitate, and organize. Azad Essa and Samia Assed, thank you so much for joining us. You could read Asad's piece on Middle East Eye. It's titled Joe Biden, Emgage, and the Muslim of Muslim Americans. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.